was very young. Siapa yang sudah main? Because the speaker in the Daiyan used to shout about mics. So today I have the relation with the speaker, but I don't have any button to shout about the mic. Sorry. Okay, brothers and sisters, we are here at the CJ debates 2015, the final. So we have three judges here. So we have Mr. Wei Jian, Mr. Calvin, and Mr. Noel Melton. Okay, members of the House, we have one motion tabled by the government to this House, and the motion is this House would impose a 2-term limit on the Selangor Chief Minister and all of the State Executive Council, State Expos. And we have Team Shababada representing the government. And we have 21 ranks representing government. First of all, I would like to invite the Honorable Prime Minister to table the motion and
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. Now, the old chief executive of Selangor was Khalid Ibrahim, and he was clearly not fit for his job. He took out loans for personal gain and abused the state apparatus so that he wouldn't have to pay these things back. He abused the state apparatus for personal gain. And now we have someone who's much better. We have Azbin Ali. He's got a lot more transparency, and at the same time, he's making a conscious effort to dissociate with the past administration. Now, the problem there is Ibrahim's removal was a public fiasco. It was messy, it was slow, there was no guarantee. Now, Mr. Speaker, imagine a world where the system makes that happen consistently. That's what we're proposing in today's debate. We don't think that the chief minister or the chief executive of Selangor should serve anything more than 2 terms. Aligned with the rest of the democracies in this world, Mr. Speaker, we don't think any political office should serve more than 2 terms. And at the same time, we think that just to make sure that the replacement of these people is a lot more feasible, we should stagger the points of re-election so that someone's always there who knows how things are going on, so that things can transition successfully. Sit down. Additional value that we're advocating for today, Mr. Speaker, is the value of political offices, accessibility to people in this democracy of Malaysia. We think that the power of office is a very important mechanism of the state, and it is your right as an individual to stand a fighting chance to be able to earn that office. And I will show you over the course of my first argument why not having term limits interferes with that right. Sit down, I'm not done yet, right? So you as an individual have a right to that chance, and we want to maximize your participation. I'm going to forward this over 2 arguments. First of all, on what the incumbency advantage is, why we think it's particularly problematic in Malaysia, and how we propose to fix that through our policy. That's the first argument. The second argument will be about how we increase the hurdles to access corruption, to practice corruption. But before that, I have one last point of context. The common argument you'll hear against this kind of policy of imposing term limits is where, well, there really might not be anyone else. We're going to reject that from the outset. Malaysia, Mr. Speaker, is not a fledgling democracy. There is no lack of capable people. There are many capable people who do not get elected anymore within every party in Malaysia, be it part of the ruling coalition or part of the opposition. There are many capable people with the education, the resources, etc., etc. So we think that that's not an argument against us that's going to fly. So what's our first argument? The incumbency advantage. What am I talking about? How does being an incumbent in office give you an advantage over anyone else who's potentially trying to get into that same office? You as a person who has had the time to do things with that office can already point to historical successes. And we think that your historical successes are going to be valued hyperbolically by the people. Why? Because it is your concrete, tangible successes versus the abstract promises of someone else. When people are evaluating these kinds of things, it is a lot more likely that they will prefer the thing that is tangible, Mr. Speaker. And this is all the more true with the power of additional political office beyond the MP seat. I'll take you after I finish this bit of analysis, right? We think that this is overwhelmingly demonstrated by the fact that most democracies in the world do implement this kind of term limit. It's empirically true. But before I move on, yes.
If people do not want to take a risk with a probable success of an imagined policy, why wouldn't they be allowed to not take that risk?
No, because what I'm telling you already is their assessment of that risk is the product of a flawed way of being presented that information, the hyperbolic discounting that I was talking about. More on that, these people who are incumbents have control of the state apparatus. They can claim capability via experience, which a new candidate cannot. And this, Mr. Speaker, is all assuming no corruption. And I don't think we can successfully assume that either. As an additional point to this argument, Mr. Speaker, in the Malaysian context, where there is little oversight from the media, for example, you're inflating the effect of that historical success. Because if you, as a person in a corrupt society, have more influence on the media, you're more likely to benefit from the media highlighting your successes rather than criticizing your flaws. And at the same time, it's going to be a lot easier to manipulate, right? Malaysia is known for its gerrymandering problem. There are so many people who vote for the opposition, but the districts they live in are huge compared to the multiple but smaller districts that the ruling coalition has put together when defining what those voting districts are. How does our policy address this problem? Because we're minimizing the impact of that. Because at least, Mr. Speaker, every 2 terms, you have someone new. We're minimizing the harm, and there's a significant degree of rotation. So even if you happen to get someone bad for a while, you're likelier to get someone new. And when you're keeping things competitive, there's more pressure for every incoming new candidate to propose something innovative, to understand what the problems are in the current context now, vis-a-vis someone in the past who might not have the incentive to do that. That's my first argument. Here's my second argument. How do we make it harder to practice corruption? We have to analyze how corruption flourishes. Corruption is done not between institutions, Mr. Speaker, but done between people who are in charge of institutions. There needs to be a high degree of trust between both parties who are party to that corruption. So it is about personal connections built over time. You rely on trust, your friends, your family, etc., etc. How do we impact that? We impact the incentive of someone who from the outset wants to be corrupt because we limit the horizon of time with which they can benefit from that. The payoff of getting in just for self-enrichment is minimized, and the extent of corruption we're expecting to see on our side is an occasional kind of looking at those opportunities. It's occasional opportunism, not a long-term life plan, because on our side, that stops becoming a feasible way of approaching this kind of world, right? There's lasting scrutiny after the fact. Businesses, Mr. Speaker, are far more likely to be aware of your corruption than the common voter. And once you're back in the regular world, you're unlikely to be employed by them or to have their business be done with you. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, this discourages those very businesses, those very people from outside the state who are party to that corruption from building those collusions in the first place, not just because there's a lower payoff, but because the new administration is far more likely to want to dissociate from the faults of the last one we are very glad to propose.
Thank you, our Honorable Prime Minister. Let me invite the opposition leader.
When they mentioned the name Khalid Ibrahim, they forgot to mention the fact that despite the fact that there was no statutory bars against him running for 2 terms, he was still successfully ousted, and the fiasco that occurred was manageable. We think that there are several mechanisms within the status quo that can act as a check and balance against the monopoly, the sort of corruption and the sort of exploitation of the state power that they would like to see. Furthermore, I would like to say that the status quo actually creates an incentive for the people who are in power to be less susceptible, to be less vulnerable to the sort of corporate capture that they also wanted to reduce. There are really 2 arguments that I'd like to talk about today. Firstly, I'll look into this debate on how you affect the democratic will of the people and how you impinge on that will. And secondly, I'll talk about how you make reform better, make it less of a fiasco, and make it more manageable as a whole. Let's move on towards my arguments, and a lot of my rebuttals will actually be intertwined with my substantive. Because firstly, let's acknowledge the fact that when you're, for example, when you talk about the context of Selangor, we are not necessarily talking about the context of a government that is very repressive and is very authoritarianism. In fact, Selangor is one of the few states in Malaysia that have a freedom of information enactment. They wanted to say that the media is controlled by the state government of Selangor, which is in fact not true at all. The fact that matters is Selangor is also recognized as being one of the few swing states in Malaysia, i.e. meaning both PR and Barisan Nasional actually has a very valid way, have a good chance of winning seats in Selangor itself. Therefore, whatever examination on policies, whatever occurring in election, especially in Selangor, is not necessarily one-sided and dominated by one-sided narrative that they would like to portray as such. So what do I mean by the democratic will of the people per se? We say necessarily, ladies and gentlemen, even those who are in power have the democratic right to share their policies and to prove that their policies have worked beforehand. They say that people would usually portray these benefits as a hyperbole because they are tangible benefits. We say that if people would like to prefer those tangible benefits that have proved to be a benefit of their life in terms of managing their education, in terms of getting their incomes increased, for example, we think that's a valid concern, because when they want to prioritize those tangible benefits over the imagined benefits of their contender, we think that's a valid square off of ideas, and the democratic will cannot be circumvented because they would like to prejudge people as being stupid and incapable of evaluating candidates. We reject that patronizing attitude. Ladies and gentlemen, moving on. We say that if people do not want to change, they deserve that right not to change. But secondly, I would like to say, obviously, it's not absolute. We agree in some circumstances they have to have a 2-term limit, but that is commensurate due to the kind of power that these positions exist. We agree, for instance, you have the 2-term limit on the President of the United States because he has the ability to command military, decide foreign policy, decide policies that affect the rest of the world, for instance. We say it doesn't apply to the Chief Minister of Selangor because he's just basically a glorified accountant to assist on instances. We say that the kind of power that he has does not warrant a limitation on him on running his policy. Therefore, it has to be proportionate to the kind of power. They have never proven that that is the case in this particular instance. Yes.
Removing Khalid Ibrahim was a public fiasco. We're lucky Azmin Ali is good. In the instance where Selangor is unfortunate to have a man who's awful and is able to control power and all the funds the government gives them from the federal state for a very long time, why is our policy not good?
Look, the fact that matters is, they've basically ignored the characterization of Selangor as a state. It is not dominated by one-sided narrative at all. It's always going to be contentious. But moreover, I'll prove later on in my argumentation, the statutory boss will create more of a fiasco than what the status quo would afford. Let's move on towards monopoly and handle some of their arguments with regards to corruption. They say, for instance, they would likely their proposal will increase the hurdles against corruption. We say no, because there's a benefit for you to maintain being in power for a long time, i.e. that the benefits of your policy and your name and reputation are already known far and wide. What are the benefits of this? Because when that reputation is already entrenched and buttressed among the population, and your benefits of you being in power is already being known by everyone, this particular person can depend less and less on corporate funding. What does this necessarily mean? Especially when it comes to Malaysia, where there are no laws on corporate lobbying. People who have remained in power can depend less on corporate funding in order to get their names known towards all corners of Selangor. This is good because then they're not less susceptible to corporate capture. And this is worsened under their proposal because you're constantly churning out, forcing new people to come out every 8 years, which inevitably makes them more dependent on corporate funding for the benefit of their campaign, making them more reliant on corporate culture. We think that is necessarily bad. But furthermore, I've already mentioned freedom of information enactment. There are already multitudes of check and balances within the status quo that can act as a counterbalance towards whatever monopoly or abuses of power. Obviously, we do not agree if these guys use state fund to run their campaign. That should be made illegal, in fact. But we don't agree in statutorily barring them from running in the election in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, for instance, in the small town of Mississauga in Canada, for instance, Hazel McCallion has been running for the position of mayor from the 80s since last year. Yes, sure, she was heavily dependent on corporate funding in the first instant that she ran for an election. But over time, when she keep on proving the worth of her policies to the constituents of that people, she can slowly stave off her dependency on that corporate funding. What eventually results when she stepped down, it's not that she was voted out, it was because she was unhealthy. Let's lastly talk about the fiasco. We think fiasco will be created worsened under their proposal, because now people who are losing power are not voted out of power, they're just simply statutorily barred. These people still hold a tremendous amount of power and influence within their power. They can still start an infighting and start an tremendous amount of inertia against the sort of reform that this fresh candidate would like to bring about. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud to stick with the status quo.
Thank you. So next, I would like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Interesting that Audi wanted to finish his speech with a comparative to mayoral races in the United States. Let's be clear, the public office that is most often accused and found guilty of corruption in the United States is people who hold positions of mayors. And there's a reason for that. The reason is A, because they can formulate that corruption over time. The reason is B, because there is less scrutiny over mayoral elections than there is over state or federal or parliamentary elections. So the argument that says the Chief Minister of Selangor has less power, therefore we ought not have checks and balances, doesn't recognize the fact that he has significant power, but also that in a world in which you are scrutinizing multiple elections in multiple times, there will always be less airtime given to the administrations of local regions than there will to federal elections and state elections. So the suggestion that there is sufficient scrutiny is untrue, and our argument was never that people are stupid and can't make an assessment. Our argument was that there are structural barriers to people in the public making a fair and reasoned assessment of these candidates. First, what is the alternative to remove people who go bad? He says there's sufficient checks and balances under the status quo. Let's be clear about what those are. First, praying and hoping that the person who is corrupt will resign under public pressure, which they have no obligation to do. Secondly, hoping that we can ensure that they lose the votes of their executive and party support, which is difficult to do. And as we saw in this particular case, the person dissolved that particular body before they could actually withdraw support. So there are structural reasons that limit the capacity for that mechanism to be effective. Finally, that the king makes an unilateral decision to remove this person from office because they are such a disgrace to the Malaysian people. We think it is probably less likely that the king wants to engage in those kinds of scandals and wants to have to justify that kind of intervention. That would be much easier if it was structurally the case that every 2 terms people changed over. Eventually that becomes the norm. Let's just not forget we live in the world where the overwhelming majority of democracies and the overwhelming majority of political offices in the world have a 2-term election. The suggestion that this would be incredibly controversial or could not be normalized over time in Malaysia and seen as par for the course is obviously ridiculous. The second contention of the opposition, Selangor is something different. It is a liberal haven with freedom of information where the opposition is strong and therefore we do not ever need to engage in checks and balances. That might be a reality right now, but there is nothing to ensure that in the future that reality remains and that it remains a freedom of information, liberal loving, opposition loving region. There's nothing that's true about that statement aside from the fact that it happens to have occurred right now. When we're talking about things as important as corruption of federal funds that are used or in fact misused, and therefore people in the public don't get the access to the services they deserve, would prefer not to hope and pray that Selangor doesn't go backwards and become more monopolistic. But also, more to the point, the suggestion that you can have freedom of information and political discourse in one region when the major newspapers and media outlets in your country are controlled federally and therefore access to freedom of information is necessarily restricted across Malaysia is obviously an obfuscation of reality. It is not true that there is incredibly free media in the region of Selangor that doesn't exist in the rest of Malaysia. That's obviously ridiculous. Let's talk about incumbency, because here's where the argument goes really astray. He says the benefit of never being booted out of office or never actually needing to leave office is that you can avoid corporate capture. Corporate capture is exactly the problem with incumbency, because you as a company are far more likely to offer funding to somebody who you know has been in political office and who is therefore, as I said, empirically more likely to be re-elected than somebody who is a new candidate. So the suggestion that being in office for a long time means you become less reliant upon corporate donations is factually inaccurate. It in fact means that your capacity to garner corporate donations and therefore your capacity to continue to get re-elected is increased. If you have problems with corporate capture, you should restrict access to corporate financing. In a world in which you cannot do that, we would prefer that you as an incumbent don't get to benefit of having more access to funds and resources simply by virtue of the position that you hold. And all of the analysis we give you about why incumbents are necessarily advantaged in any race, they discount by saying, what about the public's choice? If the public don't want to change, the public ought not have to. But that presumes the public are making a decision based on all of the information available. We tell you they're not, for 2 reasons. First of all, because structurally, the way the media works, it is more likely to play out, and given you have control to an extent over the way the media operates, you're more likely to highlight benefits of your regime or things that you have done effectively rather than face the scrutiny for the failures that you have. So the balance that's actually available is not particularly the case. Even in the best case democracy, where you do have freedom of information, individual people, Mr. Speaker, suffer from cognitive bias, which means they preference things that have happened rather than things that will happen. Here's the reason why in the vast majority of Western liberal democracies, we force people to save money and we don't give them the choice not to save for their retirement, because the overwhelming majority of people would choose not to save for their retirement. And then at the end of the day, we would all realize that that was an objectively incorrect choice when those people were forced to live on the street. Unfortunately, people make irrational decisions all of the time. It's called behavioral economics. Welcome to the world. We suggest that relying upon the individual rationality of even the most well-informed citizen is incorrect. So you presume that their choice is correct. You presume their choice is made free of all particular, as I said, cognitive biases or lack of information. We think that's untrue. We also don't think you have a right not to change, because in a world in which you benefit exclusively at the exclusion of minority groups, we would prefer that there are multiple different candidates who get a chance to be in office so that you don't always get to benefit as a result of that. Go ahead, Shitab.
Yeah, US presidential election runs the biggest media regimes and invest the highest amount of money because corporations gain more profit because it's all win or all lose, right? So how does that really compare with the reality?
That's like an argument against the presidential system because it's all win or all lose. I don't really think you can compare that. But I also don't know what the outcome of your policy is to change that, because it is also true that you claim we cannot regulate corporate donations. We think it is far more likely that you will benefit from corporate capture if you are the person who is already in office, because you are the one who is more likely to have relationships with businesses in your area and more likely to be able to promise continued support of those businesses if you remain in office, which you are far more likely to. So the actual answer to that question is regulate corporate financing, and in the instance that you can't do it, have a multitude of candidates in there such that no one person can ever make guarantees. And here's where they completely miss any rebuttal to the argument about corruption. They say Selangor is a great place that is free from corruption. We have given you actual examples of where that's not the case, but also let's remember, we are preventing things from becoming bad in the future. We think when you're playing with something as significant as huge amounts of public funding and people's lives, because we do actually think the Minister of Selangor has some power to do something, we would suggest that you should err on the side of caution and ensure that that corruption cannot develop. We give you a huge amount of analysis in Niccolo's speech about why necessarily term limits limit your capacity to be corrupt. They claim corruption doesn't exist, which is obviously a farce. At the end of the day, they cannot both say that the Chief Minister of Selangor has no role whatsoever and is highly unimportant, but also claim that we're totally stomping on public choice. We think public choice is misinformed. We are the team that protects the public. Support term limits.
And next, let me invite the deputy opposition leader.
Ladies and gentlemen, this debate is comparative. It's all fine and dandy for them to come up and say, there have been some instances of corruption. We can give you ample amounts of policies that have been benefited by the amount of consistency that has happened. We tell you that housing policies subsidizing for the urban poor that have happened within Selangor has been beneficial and would not have been able to continue at the point when opposition comes in and wants to change it after a few years because these type of policies take a long time to implement. There are benefits to these policies at the point when we can tell you that Cherasa's gang violence is something that the Selangor state government has worked actively hard to eradicate and has been successful in doing so because of their longevity and power and the links that they have with the police system and the trust that they build up with the community as a result. So they can bring up problems of corruption that have happened in the past. We can also tell you a lot of benefits that have happened under our model. The debate is therefore decided on who can prove it is more likely that the benefits can happen. And secondly, even if it's equally likely for the benefits or harms to happen, who is the best arbiter? No, thank you. Who is the best arbiter of determining whether or not the direction that the state is going to is good or not? And we tell you that is for the people. Let's deal with a couple of rebuttals that came out in their case. First, they want to tell us from PM and onward that people have historical biases towards past successes and therefore are incapable of making correct decisions based on currently available information. A couple of responses to this. One, we don't think people only tune into the news during election time and forget 10 years of what the government has done within their states and within their local regions. If they achieved benefits during that time, people do not suddenly develop amnesia. That's also part of the behavioral economics, Gemma, and they know that this government will continue to provide those sorts of benefits. If, on the other hand, no thank you, the government has effed up during its reign, the people are also made aware of that, despite what the media tells them or does not tell them, and are able to make rational, informed choices about that. This brings me to my second point about the nature of the people who live within Selangor and the media within it. We told you that people within Selangor happen to be a very urban population, rather educated. They are politically inclined and motivated to participate within the political system. This means they are aware of issues that often go on, not only within their locality, no thank you, but also within their state as well. So we tell you, therefore, and we also have told you regarding the media in this state, that the media is actually quite balanced, particularly within Selangor, in contrast to the rest of the nation. What this means is that people actually, A, are informed about what has gone on in their state, B, that they have access to information on publicly available channels in the newspapers and on TV about the policies that the government has implemented, and both their negatives and their harms, because that media happens to be balanced. But even if you want to argue to us, no thank you, that the national media, which is controlled by the ruling government, has overwhelmed any sort of balance that exists within Selangor, that problem is a national one and exists in your model as well. So even if you tell me that the media that the national media overwhelms all these people, that people will still be able to vote for that same party. Instituting a term limit means I can't vote for this individual anymore. But the media does not focus on individuals, rather it focuses on the policies of the party because everyone follows the same party line. The opposition, who is that you say is so good against corruption, all that stuff, will still not be voted in at the point when the media, if it's so influential, will still control it. The only thing you substitute is an individual from the same party. That's all you change under your mind. Yes.
On all of our analysis that said corruption is largely done on the basis of individual trust and relationships, and if the worst case of our particular policy is that individuals rotate, that is still better than your policy.
Here's what we tell you under ARMA. So they concede essentially our argument about the media is correct, basically, and that people are therefore informed if they only want to rely, therefore, on corruption in order for them to win this debate. And we told you at the end of the day that corruption is something that can exist on both sides of the house. The opposition can come in and still be corrupted as well. But here's the thing. We also tell you that the benefits that are long-term are things that are also possible. What are some of these long-term benefits before I get to the corruption issue? We tell you that policies that enact real change within society take a long time to actually develop. I gave you the example of the housing development subsidies for the poor, the gang violence that exists in Shiraz. That same trust that is built, is the foundation of the corruption that you say happens, is the same thing that makes it a more effective when good policies come into play. It is the same trust with not only the local police force, with the local media, with journalists and people within society that is able to allow these people to continue. The example that she wanted to rebut from Audi was very minimal at best. Hazel McCallion was consistently voted in as mayor of Mississauga until she was 93. And the reason why is not because she was corrupt, and not because, even though accusations existed of her corruption, is because A, people are aware because of the media, but B, even if there were accusations of corruption, they knew the benefits they had gotten despite the corruption, and they were willing to make an informed choice that I like the benefits that I got, and that is despite any corruption that may exist. Maybe they are corrupt, but I've gotten a lot of benefits, and I'm able to make an informed choice about it. That's a benefit we have under our model. Secondly, the next point. Let's talk about why corporate lobbying will actually be less under our model as well. In the status quo, there is little accountability for corporate funding that exists. We tell you that politicians often don't want to take corporate funding because at that point the media, which is vigorous within Selangor, will point out that they have taken massive amounts of corporate funding, and they'll be pointed out there. We tell you that that is in the interest of these people not to take that funding. But at the point when you have only 2 terms, you're more reliant on that funding in order to persist. We tell you when you have a longer time to not only institute the benefits of your policy, but you also have a longer time in order to build trust within the state as well. This is the point when you don't need corporate funding, because I can say I'm going to get voted in regardless of whether you give me money or not, because I know my people will give me money and I'm going to be voted in. You can either help me with my policy or stand aside. That is when corruption is more limited in society as a result. At the end of the day, gerrymandering is something that, and corruption is something that can happen under both sides. But we tell you that because people are able to make informed decisions about how people are voted in. Because look, the state legislature is the one that's selected. People vote for the party that will be the state legislature. They announce who the chief minister will be and who the cabinet will be. So people vote for the party knowing who the chief minister is going to be at the end of the day. If there was corruption that happened, for example, and the king removed them, it's the same thing that happens under status quo in like the US and Canada as well, where we discovered halfway through the term he was corrupt. We kicked him out. We put someone else in his place. The same thing happens under our model as well. That's not mutually exclusive to remove corrupt people from office. But what is mutually exclusive is the longevity of the benefits that we bring to you on our side of the house and the trust that is built within society. People are able to make rational, educated choices about whether they want those long-term tangible benefits or the intangible harms. At the end of the day, people are educated. They not only look at past success, but past failure as well. We believe in the power of the people, and we don't think they're too stupid to make this decision.
Maybe while the big
Areas like Kuala Selangor and Klang are part of Selangor. These are areas that are not urbanized, do not have a largely educated population and therefore don't have access to the sort of modern, fair, balanced media you speak of in Selangor. We're not saying people are irrational. We're saying they're subject to manipulation by parties that run for elections, and therefore we should try to safeguard them against the risk of an individual having a stronghold on corruption. They have failed to engage with our primary substantiation of the potential for corruption to occur. Here is the question that we are faced with today. Should we rely on the potential benevolence of parties in power and individuals, or should we rely on a system that structurally reduces the potential for corruption to occur? Azmin Ali is amazing. Khalid Ibrahim was shit. They both come from the same party. What that tells you is rotating individuals from the same party has an objective, definitive benefit, because individuals formulate personal relationships of trust with companies, with members of the ExCo to run corrupt systems and businesses. In the instance where half your ExCo disappears every 8 years at most, and your chief minister gets changed as well, your ability to form a network of trust that will cover up for you continually is not probable, or is less likely. Why did Khalid Ibrahim get away with what he did for so long if Selangor had an amazing amount of people and an amazing amount of check and balance from the media? We're not saying they don't. We're saying there is a potential for a lack and a loss of information. We would like to hedge against that. Now here's their next contention. Continuity. Violence in Cheras has reduced. Selangor is now a much better place for poorer people because they had housing. Azmin Ali did not reverse these policies. You know why? Because he's a good person. He recognizes the benefits behind these policies. And if I'm a person who has one term at stake in the future, I will support good policies and not scrap the good stuff. We're not saying people forget the bad stuff, but it is very easy to forget the minor flaws of an individual when you can run hyperbole like, we provided housing for the poor. Now, a poor person doesn't care about the financial corruption you've committed or the bank loans you've amassed and refused to pay. Why? Because they care about what they could tangibly see. What we ensure from our side is a more comprehensive approach to elections, where individuals are valued for their credentials and their ability to actually push forward. It forces individuals to engage with the community on the ground and to create policy that actually has a long-term impact. Especially in a swing state like Selangor, where the opposition has a motive, or the ruling party of the day has a motive to ensure that it gets re-elected. Then we ensure the continuity of policy. So continuity is not a problem in this debate. What this debate is about is which side reduces the potential for corruption. And before that,
there's a perverse incentive for the successor to delegitimize completely his predecessor. How do you guarantee that good policies of the predecessor continues on?
A good policy that is visibly good is difficult to delegitimize. If the policy can be delegitimized in the eye of the public very easily, then your public is uneducated. You've got to pick one. Are people stupid not to recognize a good policy and it would be easily delegitimized by a successor, or are people intelligent enough to recognize good policy? Because if they are intelligent enough to recognize good policy, then they would be able to prevent this individual from delegitimizing the incumbent. But more importantly, they're going to say, I'm shafting myself. I'm not, because I'm telling you, regardless of how intelligent people are, the potential for irrationality, manipulation of the media, and manipulation of individuals is really high when it comes to this particular scenario. When it comes to the scenario of going, he might have credentials, but I have created changes and you can trust me. But that doesn't mean people can't put two policies next to each other and evaluate which one is more legitimate. Because trust me, that's going to come up from the next speech. Now, here are a couple of things to deal with Hazem. First, we've already dealt with this idea of continuity of policy on two levels. First, we told you there's a national incentive to continue good policy. But second, they've missed the part of our policy that said staggered elections to ensure that people are actually able to relate between different terms to ensure continuity of good policy. Next, he told you that the media will focus on the party and not the individual. We have no problem with that, because we tell you that the individual gets changed, the party's policies are consistent, two individuals within the same party can have different policies, engage with that. Finally, and the most irritating part of their speech, corporate capture is higher under their model. Let's first understand something. Most of Malaysia's elections are run via corporate lobbying. It's not the United States of America. But even if it is run via lobbying, sit down. In the instance where you have to lobby a new individual or a new executive council every 5 years because they change on a staggered period of time, no single company gets a hold on the government, because you've got to argue that that one company is going to convince every single human being who's part of the EXCO and the possible chief minister for the next 50 years to pander to them. When you have multiple interests of corporate lobbying, guess what? They neutralize each other. So here's the part of corporate funding that you've got to engage with. A business is now less likely to engage with a politician who's encouraging it to participate in corruption. Why? Because the business entity is aware of the risk that it is putting itself in. It is exposing itself to the scrutiny of the successor. It is exposing itself to the potential cronyism of the successor in removing that particular company because it is inefficient. It is exposing itself to the efficiency of the next government that will remove it if it is proven to be part of corruption. So not only do we disincentivize the incumbent from actually participating in corruption because there is no real benefit to reap over a very short period of time, and also we discourage individuals who run only for corruption from running. We do also discourage companies from playing the other part. So if people might still want to be corrupt, a company that has profit on the line and its brand and marketing value and existence of the market on the line, it is now discouraged from doing so. What we've told you from our side is it is possible to build successful institutions with continued good, positive policy, even when the people change. What we tell you is people within the same party can be different. Khairi Jamaluddin next to any other UMNO people you don't like. There is a massive difference between those two. Azmin Ali and Khalid Ibrahim. Massive difference between those two. Our problem is how do you curb the high potential for corruption that comes by default when you know you can hold your office for 50 years by gerrymandering the system via executive authority.
Thank you very much. So let me invite the next speaker, the whip from the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, this debate is primarily about what democracy should stand for, which is something that they haven't engaged with. But secondly, this debate is also about the state of Selangor and how the state of Selangor is a unique state, and therefore this should be the one state where you should not put up unnecessary checks and balances when checks and balances already work, i.e. we have seen how the most corrupt person was already usurped by people. That proves that even people don't even need an election per se. If there was an election, it would have been usurped anyway, right? So when you have that degree of checks and balances, why do you want to stifle democracy? But the third clash that I'm going to deal with is the fact that corporate capture is worse under their paradigm, and as far as corruption goes, it's essentially mutually exclusive and it's worse under their paradigm. Now moving on, first, the first thing that we talk about is the fact that people now vote on valid concerns. They want to see people who are successful. So what that means is people vote based on tangible gains, right? Therefore, they ground their decisions on those things. They needed to argue with us on a principle ground why that is wrong for people at the first place, right? Just one example cannot do anything, especially when that one example is the person who was usurped from his position at the first place, right? Under their paradigm, people are forced to vote based on hypothetical grounding. This is the worst part about their case. They haven't engaged
engage with why the people will have any realistic metrics in terms of why they should be voting for these people, and that's the worst part about their case. So they do not give us any alternative. But the second thing that they also did not deal with is the fact that right to run for people is a very important right. And when you do impose statutory limitations based on those rights, you have to show why that doesn't work objectively or most of the times. The point at which you accept that it has worked most of the times, especially for Selangor, why is it a very compelling reason at the first place, right? Therefore, they talk about, oh, their historical bias and things like that. And that's where we tell you the fact that Azmin Ali resigned shows that he was scared of people's resentment, and that actually signifies the level of democracy that is actually there. But even if he did not resign, and if you're stupid enough to do it, we tell you he would have been voted out anyway. And they did not engage with this conclusion. The fact that he would have been voted out anyway, and why that is not the sufficient checks and balances, and why you need to undermine people's choices at the first place. If people want to vote successful candidates because they know that candidate caters to their needs, why should there be a statutory limitation on that? That is something that they haven't engaged with, right? But the third thing that they also haven't engaged with is the fact that people can and do take those good decisions, right? But what's even worse is now under their paradigm, they also disenfranchise candidates who can enact change, and that's the alternative that they did not deal with. Right? So because they also need to accept the harm that if there is a certain candidate who is bringing like awesome reforms, that candidate also cannot be elected under their paradigm after 2 terms. But therefore, the concession is we have an awesome candidate who has done a lot of awesome things, and that candidate can no longer be elected under their paradigm. So even in terms of practicalities, we see those harms are worse under their paradigm, right? But the third important fact about democratic rights that they did not engage with is the fact that consistent reform is possible only under our side. Because yes, we do agree, politicians do have to pander to corporations because they need money to win elections. They have to pander to party because they need support along party lines. Those are harms that exist under both sides. But under our side, you can be a seasoned politician. You can have a track record of success, and you can refer to that track record. And these are 3 exclusive benefits that exist only if you can get elected again and again. Therefore, they have been dismissive of all the examples that we have given, which allows you to enact systematic change, right? And that's the engagement that needed to be there. But therefore, the fact that you will have growing dependence based on what you do for people is an inevitable fact. And they did not engage with that argument at all, right? Especially when they agree that when it comes to media, etc., there are sufficient checks and balances. Selangor is one of the 2 only states which have things like freedom of information policy, and therefore they needed to show us what's the urgency in Selangor at the first place, right? And that's something that they haven't shown us. Now, therefore, they haven't engaged with why we need to undermine the democratic right. But secondly, they also haven't shown us why there is any urgency, because their example of Azmin Ali shows the degree of democratic strength, especially in the state of Selangor. But before I move into my second clash,
you explicitly said you're perfectly fine with Obama running 2 terms because he's got a lot of power. A chief minister has all the funding in the world to control and all policies. Why is it in the case of a president, you're not stifling democracy and you're not giving people something to run, but in the case of the state, you are? Argue that.
See, this is what I'm going to show you now, and you did not engage with the characterization of the presidents, right? In terms of how presidents are more likely to be prone to corporate capture. And these are harms that they did not engage with at all. Therefore, as far as corporate capture goes, and in terms of US presidency, etc., goes, Audi has already told you why the US president is an exceptional case, because he essentially has power over so many domains. That's not the case with the Selangor prime minister, right? So that's one thing. As far as corporate capture goes, they haven't engaged with the characterization at all. How I, as a candidate, need a bigger amount of campaign donation, because in the alternative, I can be a good candidate with a good history of successes, but now I don't have that benefit anymore. Therefore, there's going to be a greater number of candidates who are maybe likely to get elected. But when that happens, when that crowding in happens, all these candidates need a lot more money to win election. And that is the rat race that only they allow. And that is why the US presidential election is the biggest presidential engine. Gemma was extremely dismissive about my POI in terms of how that would not be replicated, especially in Selangor. When you agree that Selangor happens to be the hub of economy, and in Selangor corporations have a greater benefit in terms of being able to capture, right? In terms of being able to capture. But secondly, also understand the fact that, you know, corporations like Goldman Sachs often fund both parties. Therefore, during the last presidential election, we saw how they actually funded both Obama and Mitt Romney. We tell you that sort of thing can also happen. But more importantly, under your paradigm, if their candidate does win, they also gain a lot more. Therefore, those are 3 very compelling following reasons, corporate capture is going to be worse under their paradigm, especially in Malaysia, where we do concede there is lesser regulation when it comes to corporate funding, right? Therefore, what is going to happen? Now candidates have to make more and more substantial promises. Candidates have to make more and more substantial compromises, because that's the only way candidates can get elected. We're the only ones who don't just give you the democratic mandate, but we're the only side who also give candidates the ability to mature over time and do even better things and grow out of that corporate culture. And that's the harm that they haven't dealt with at all, right? But as far as corruption goes, we have seen how that scenario played out. We know it's illegal and things like that. Upon discovery, you already get voted out. These are the conclusions that they haven't dealt with. Like, why wouldn't you be goddamn voted out upon discovery of corruption and things like that? But thirdly, if there are any structural barriers, we still don't know what the structural barriers are. Those structural barriers are going to exist under both sides. But under our side, we have the exclusive benefit of media already having that degree of checks and balances. But what's even worse is under your paradigm, you are essentially doing something extremely disproportional and which is not consistent with the principles of democracy at all. Therefore, apart from the fact that they're discouraging principles of democracy, the worst part about their case is they're doing something extremely disproportional about something that doesn't need to happen and worsens the situation. And that's the reason they should lose this debate. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have heard speeches from both sides, and let me invite one representative from the opposition to reply.
Ladies and gentlemen, throughout this debate, Saudi government has made value judgments about what people should and should not consider when making their decision about who to vote for in these elections. We tell you that people are able and capable and do make their own decisions for who they elect and who they want to lead them. The potential for harm that Moustafa said in response to that argument exists anyways. Their argument is, with increased time, there's a longer potential for corruption to happen. We told you in response, with increased time, there's also a longer potential for the good policies that have been enacted to also be far more effective and to institute greater change within the area. That percentage of its increasing is 50-50. Therefore, given that that potential for good and bad in the long term is equal on both sides, we tell you that the people should be able to decide whether or not they like where it's going or not. In response to that, they told us that the media is always one-sided and people cannot differentiate between good policies and bad. Let's look at what some of their responses were. Moustafa told us in his speech, but the poor don't care about corruption. Sure, we gave them good housing policies, but the poor don't care about that and they will make bad decisions. Who are you to tell them that's a bad decision? If they got a house because of it and they don't care about corruption, that is up to them to decide that. The second response they want to give us, oh, but there are poor people that are less educated, so they can't make that decision. So Selangor has some poor people that can't decide. Therefore, we remove their ability to vote and we just only put new people, new faces all the time. That makes absolutely no sense. We never implied to you that Selangor is completely made up of urbanites. There's no poor person. Everybody has a PhD and is able to perfectly allocate who they want to vote for. In your case, only the opposition. We think that people have a diverse range of views on what is or is not important to them. The debate you want to have is about whether should people take a political awareness test before they necessarily vote. That's the wrong debate, and that's the one that you guys beat out in prep. Secondly, they want to say, if there's a good policy that we have, it's obviously a good policy, and we won't remove it, aka the person that replaced the former corrupt minister. Here's the thing, the person that replaced him obviously is from the same party, so obviously they're not going to select someone from the opposition to be chief minister after they just outed the former chief minister from their party. Secondly, if that person is going to want to continue that good policy because it represents their policy, it represents their political party. But if it was an opposition member that took over now instead of the current party, that person would want to distance themselves and their record from anything their predecessor did. So even if it was a good policy that is obviously good, they will use the same media that you say is biased. They will use that to tell people, oh, but it wasn't that good. I can do better. And because they're now in power, they will remove those good policies in order to make themselves more credible and differentiate themselves from their past predecessors. The other response they want to give us, they tell us under their model, look guys, there's going to be less corruption because at least there's only 5 or 8 years, there's less corporations that are fighting for power. There's more corporations fighting for power, and therefore there's going to be less corruption. No one corporation can dominate. Moustafa, telling us that you have lots of corporations in your model does not negate that the same number of corporations also exist in the status quo under our model as well. The same number of corporations that will be fighting for those special interests will also be fighting for the same number of special interests in our model. So that is equal on both sides. Again, the people are able to decide that influence. And we tell you at the point when the long-term benefit to these people, politicians, who are mostly good. We've told you that politicians don't want to take money from corporations at the point when they have a longer term to implement their actions and policies, and people are able to use that trust built upon them in order to enact those things. That is the point when they rely less on corporate sponsorship in the future, and can in the future actually remove laws that actually enable those corporate sponsorships to occur. At the end of the day, we tell you that the balanced local media within Selangor, something they completely negated and only want to talk about corruption at the point when they realize the media was fair, is something that allows people to make their own informed decisions. We tell you, go with the side of the people, go with the side of democracy, and let people decide what's important to them. If bad happens, so be it, but the people can live with the decision because they know the long-term benefit for good is just as high.
The only response the opposition offered to the suggestion by government that good policy would likely be continued by anybody who took over office again was that given the media does not accurately represent elections or policies, it is also likely that they would be able to capitalize upon that inaccurate media representation to delegitimize good policy. That is the sole response they offer. At the point at which that is true, they must necessarily accept that the problems with media representation of policies in the new person's term must also be true in the election term, thereby accepting that the choice of individuals that is the principled contention of their case is unlikely to be an accurate reflection of the best interests of those people. So one of two worlds has to exist, and they must exist wholly as opposed to dependent on which argument you're talking about in this debate. It is either the case that all of the time the media offers inaccurate or unfair representations of politics. And at the point at which you accept that to be true, we say the way you hedge against the risk of bad policy being continued for a long time is to ensure a diversity of candidates with multiple different interests, even when they come from the same party. We've offered you examples of that to be true. But if you accept their contention that the media of Selangor is fair, that the people of Selangor are politically engaged and capable of assessing their own best interests, then you must also accept that it is likely good policy will be difficult to delegitimize. The one argument they offer to you why principally this is wrong and you ought not restrict choice from people is because there might be benefits that they gain from continuing to elect the same person. If that is the case, you must demonstrate to us why those benefits cannot be continued, which you failed to do by skirting around the context in this debate and being unwilling to accept one or the other. So let's talk about principles. At the end of this debate, there were multiple principles at play. One was your right to vote for a candidate, which we told you was contingent upon you being able to exercise that vote in your own best interests. At the point at which you were giving someone a right to do something, which subsequently led to them being worse off, we didn't believe that was a valuable right to protect. And so the lack of willingness to engage with the fact that there are cognitive biases and difficulties in assessment of candidates, irrespective of the media of Selangor, was a problem for their case. But the other right was for the candidates who struggle to be elected because of incumbency advantages that are demonstrable demonstrably true across many countries that are more free and more fair, I hate to say it, than Malaysia. So those were principles that needed to be considered. The benefits they offer to you are two. Continuity of policy. We tell you if it is good, it is likely to be retained. And that is also true because they concede that it is likely that a government member would be from the same political party, which means their overarching interests are probably the same, but they might have different priorities or different ways of actualizing those interests. It was unclear why that wouldn't be true. It was also unclear at the end of this debate why 10 years was an insufficient amount of time for a good policy to have the effect that you intended. But if continuity is true, continuity of corruption is also a consideration in this debate, one that they needed to engage with. The alternatives they provide are incredibly minimal. We would suggest that you ought not make policies about checks and balances on the basis of what is right now, but on the basis of what could be. Given the overwhelming corruption of the majority of states of Malaysia, we thought it was probably an unrealistic assessment to say that Selangor was somehow above that. In that instance, we thought it was fair to defer against the harm that would be likely. With regards to political capture and corporate influence, this argument was inconsequential in the debate. And the reason for that was because the opposition never explained why we could not both solve that problem by restricting corporate donations, which was the solution we offered early in this debate. There was no mutual exclusivity with regards to this policy. That meant we couldn't resolve that. We also provided you logic about why it was worse under their policy. The benefits of continuity would likely be retained in the instance where people had the kind of scrutiny they suggested. And if that was the case, we would like to prevent the risk of overwhelming corruption, which is present in the rest of Malaysia. That's why we take the debate.
Thank you. So on behalf of the House, well done to both the government and the opposition, and give a round of applause to that. So we have a motion here, a total limit on the Selangor Chief Minister and all the state expo, legal and debated. So we will invite the judges to read and make decisions.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
I have no idea.